My name is Claire. I'm going to be hosting this Q&A on behalf of the Belgrade this evening. And it's my very great pleasure to welcome back to the stage our fantastically, superbly talented cast. And they are joined, we're very lucky to have them both here, by Lian Wilkinson, who's a producer on the show, and Justine Themen, who is both Associate Director for the Belgrade Theatre and the show's director. We are open to taking your questions, whatever they are. We'd love to hear from you about tonight's show, what you thought of the performance, and what you saw. And I would always say there's no such thing as a bad question. So if there's something burning for you that you would like to ask, please don't be shy. We'd love to have the conversation with you. Is that all right? We'll have about 20 to 25 minutes together, and I understand some of you might need to leave a little bit early, and that's fine. So please do leave when you need to, but we'll hope you can stay if you can. Okay, I'm going to kick us off with a question, and Lian, I'm looking at you. Because, Lian, you're credited with the original idea for this show, and I wondered if you can tell us a little bit about where that came from.
Yeah, so I think I had the very seed of this idea back in something like 2016. There was a video that went viral by a cosmetics brand, which was all about the marriage markets, and there's this video of parents and daughters coming together talking about what it means to be a leftover woman, and it's really emotional in terms of talking about how an unmarried daughter is like heartburn. It's like an illness for the father, and it's just really, it's such an emotionally charged thing where you have the parents wanting to marry off their daughters because it comes down to family, it comes down to the children's happiness, but where is the woman's agency in that? And that's what we wanted to explore in this play. And so I was talking to Justine, and we brought along Amy, the writer, and we had a development week in March with most of the cast here tonight. And from there we really created the characters and the scenes, and we made what Anti Umbrella is now.
And I understand that you talked about the agency of women, and the agency of women in the face of commoditisation feels like it's, I understand, it's been very central to the telling of this story, and I wonder if you could tell us a little bit more about that as the premise.
Yeah, I think when Lian first spoke to me about the idea, it interested me a lot because I'm really interested in the female narrative and making sure that it's told more often and in all its complexity. But when she spoke about the idea originally, I thought, how do we make this story that's essentially about the Chinese experience, how do we make it resonant to here? Because I think it's very easy for the West, but the UK particularly because of its relationship with China, to exoticize those narratives and to make them feel like other and strange and not like us. Whereas actually I think what Lian found in that video that she uncovered in that story was a commonality with women's experiences here in the UK and across the world. So what we spoke about was how do we make that story resonant here? And of course there's a very large Chinese population in the city coming to study at both of the two universities, so that felt like an obvious place to anchor the narrative, and then also providing the main character Wei with a British flatmate so that we could follow her journey as well and try and draw parallels between Wei's experience and between Lucy's experience in terms of the pressure to be in a relationship, and then in Lucy's case to be in a relationship that isn't very healthy for her, that isn't really defined by her. We heard her on the phone talking about Peter's only wanting to come over when she's not on her period, so only to have sex with her, so in a way she's objectified as well, she's not got agency in that relationship. So it was really important to look at that narrative for women so that we could see what's happening to our Chinese sisters, or the experiences our Chinese sisters are having, and how that connects with ours, as well as the things that are different and that we can learn about each other.
And I guess the commonalities between generations of women, because we see very clearly 3 generations in one family, and while there feels like at times there are very clear differences, the things that unite them as well.
I think that was a really interesting thing about this story, the intergenerational play between the three women of the family. And I think, especially my family is from Guangdong, from Jiangmen, which is very close to where the show is set. And in China, because there's such a booming economy and the middle class has grown so massively, the differences between generations and the way that people see the world is so different compared to most other countries, because China's going through such a huge identity evolution at the moment, that the generational divide between families, and even if the families are quite close, you find that people who are my age, for example, think about the world very differently to their parents, and that's further different to their grandparents. So that intergenerational divide is really interesting to explore, especially in the context of nouveau feminism, third or fourth wave feminism, or however you want to describe it, and about women finding their own agency, and the ripple effect of things like the one-child policy, and the ratio of women to men in current society, and all of those effects have lasting effects across generations. So it's really interesting to see how those same policies affect women of different generations in completely different ways.
How the self is shaped by society.
Totally.
And even when that society shifts, how it continues, as you say, to have that impact across the generations. And I think I felt like I really saw that tonight when I watched the show. Let's have a question from the audience. Anybody got anything they would like to ask or to say?
May I have the first question?
Yes, of course.
Yay!
The first one, I'm really curious about the stage. It's like a reflection, because I can see there's a circle in the center, and there is another circle in the background. So may I know what is the meaning in there?
If I answer a little bit about the process that Mei and I, the designer, went through, it was quite an interesting one, because, again, going back to this, we had this conversation about exoticism with each of the different artists that were involved in making this show. And Mei was very keen for it, for the set to reflect a contemporary China, not to reflect the tradition or something culturally specific. She wanted it to be about modern China and how it's evolving. And she was looking at modern buildings, modern architecture, looking at things that were quite clean lines, this idea of the holes where it's quite sort of IKEA, where you can peg things in, and all that, functional, exactly. And it was really interesting in the conversations that we had, because in the end, she couldn't pull away from circles. And circles for her as Moongate, is that right, is what it's called, often, and I'm sure you'll know better than me, a boundary, a liminal space between the public and the private, which of course is a really important dividing line between masculinity and femininity, both in the West and in Confucian ideology. And also, I know very important for Mei, as we were talking about it, a liminal space between the physical world, the living world, and the spiritual world, or the world of the dead. And of course, circles are also very feminine. So Mei found she couldn't keep away from circles in terms of their place in Chinese culture, but also in terms of the telling of a female story. So that's really where that came from. And of course, it works very well with, but it also works against this sort of much more functional space that she set them in. And then the space in the second half that's created is as Wei literally digs deeper into her past and her understanding of her own culture, her contact with grandma and the earth and the lychee trees and the babies that are maybe even buried underneath them. That's what was creating that space was about. Good question.
Yeah, it was a very good question. I assume you liked the set.
Sorry?
You liked the set.
I like the set, the design. But actually, we're expecting more, because it looked like some kind of yin-yang.
Yes, exactly.
So like, still expecting something else from that. I have another opinion, feeling I would like to share, because I have been to different countries and cities after I graduated from high school. So when I come to UK, I talk to people. They will say, "Oh, you don't look like the people from China," and I will ask them back. So, what do you think the people from China? I'm really curious. Like, I also asked Rachel, when you see this show, do you think that is really Chinese? How do we really look like? And they said, yeah, maybe, but actually we feel the distance between who you are on the stage and who we really are in the reality. So we really like anything you want to share?
Yeah, we didn't. It's not our stories, and it's not story from people who I know in my real life, or my friends, or my relatives. No one really like that.
And how?
I just didn't see the connection between the story on stage and my real life.
Cool.
Because, for example, I'm at the same age as the story, the main character. I'm 26 or close to 27, but I never have the same kind of feeling. My parents or my grandparents pushed me to get married now.
Yeah.
So yeah, I know that like our women, they are actually in every society, but in the past, maybe 1 decade before, we have this kind of tendency to face this kind of phenomenon. But now, recently, I don't think it's
better.
Yes, much better.
I do understand
Yeah,
the sentiment. May I speak a little bit? I'm Korean. When I read the story, obviously I can imagine that in an urban setting in China, now things change so much, so quickly. You wouldn't find marriage market like this maybe, but however, in rural areas, they do exist, and there are generations of people behaving like this. My own grandmother, I learned later on, my grandmother wanted a boy, a grandson, rather than granddaughter. I have a very good relationship with her, and I learned how to deal with it later on. I felt very resentful when I learned that she actually wanted a boy. So things happen. It's not just China. Korea, Japan, I'm sure
UK.
everywhere. It's changing, thank God. And I do understand you don't feel like, oh, this is not my story, but these stories existed for a long time, and they do exist somewhere in the world.
And just sort of building on that, we did do research with Chinese students who have come to Coventry. I mean, we did a group consultation session with a lot of young women in their 20s, sort of mid-20s, of various different ages, and most of them had an identification with the story in some way, even if it wasn't their actual experience. And one of the key influences for us was a particular PhD student from Warwick University who told us her story, and we used that a lot to influence what the story was we told on stage. So it is the story or experiences of very many students still arriving, even though it might not be yours.
Yeah, I totally get what you mean. Like, so for me personally, my family is from this province. Like, my family is from Zhang, and I'm 26, so I'm the same age as Wei. And I was asked in an interview when we were promoting the show, actually, by the interviewer, is this the experience of your family? And I was like, not even slightly. My family is incredibly matriarchal, full of really powerful women, and the question of whether I should get married. Like the play. The question of whether I should get married at a specific time does not come up because they know how I'll respond. But despite that, I feel like lots of women do experience this story, and it may not be our story, but if this is true and the word leftover woman has become official dictionary term, then clearly there are enough people experiencing this for it to be something that we need to talk about. If it's a seed that needs to be pulled out, then we should talk about it. And if we are privileged enough to not have that experience, then perhaps we can use our privilege to put light on this story that needs to be unveiled and it needs to be assessed. And we need to talk about it for our peers, for our sisters who do experience this story in real life.
Can I ask a question to the audience? There's a question over here.
Yes.
Great. I'm really glad that this is not your story because it's so tragic.
Yeah.
And the more, when we did a research,
we found out that this is quite a minority case, but sometimes in China, a minority is a big group of people. And like I said, I'm glad this is not your story because it's so tragic. But I wonder, as you sit there and you go, this is not my story, this is not the China I know, what sort of connections can you make, or did you not make any connections with the play or the story?
I think this ties into a question that my group has, because C and I are both from Hong Kong, and we've never heard of the superstition of, can't keep an umbrella open indoors. So we wonder if it's, just us being ignorant, or if it's a British superstition translated for this play.
It's Hong Kong writer. Her heritage, so it's absolutely,
She's Hong Kong and Lego, but for her, she was like, the umbrella thing's a really big thing for my family. So it might also be a generational thing, which again just shows how vastly different generations have changed throughout a booming
it's
Asia.
also not that old.
No.
No, it's not what I mean at all. It's not what I mean at all. Come on.
It is quite a common universality as well in like France and England and lots of other countries. Those sort of superstitions would be upheld.
Yeah, we thought it worked really well, so we're glad you used it.
It's also the sense of unresolved things, conversations unhad, truths not shared or explored together that comes through the ghosts that emerge in the story. And I think whether that's something you know or recognise, I think there has to be also a degree of artistic licence in how these women start to share some of these stories together. Sorry, Rachel, you had a question. Let's come to you.
Honestly, it's lovely. It's lovely to hear all the different things. I think I'm just trying to think of my response to that feeling of disconnection that you mentioned, because I think it becomes a problem for a company of actors who want to tell a story, that they shouldn't have to take the burden of an entire nation. You're telling particular stories, and I think that's kind of the issue, isn't it? That you shouldn't have to represent. You can't possibly do that, and that's not what theatre or art does anyway. We always go in through the particular, and maybe there are some little resonances that we make along the way. And that's certainly how I feel. I brought you to come and see this today, but by no means do I go, all my Chinese students, because you're not all Chinese. We've got Korean students, we've got Taiwanese students, we've got, it doesn't work like that. So I think that's the other interesting thing about this event, especially because it's against Rock of Ages or whatever. When I came in tonight and you see Rock of Ages, and I saw Joanne Clifton off Strictly Come Dancing, I was trying to explain to the girls what Strictly Come Dancing means. And it's just, this is, I guess what I'm saying is that this moment is more than the story, isn't it?
I agree,
It's about you trying to find a connection between what I see out in the city, what I see in my campus, what I see in with my students who come to work with us, that people are trying to tell a story. It's not the story, but it's a story that maybe resonates. And then the other thing that I was going to say before that was brought up, and I hope this connects, is that for me the connection point was about mothers. I've just recently become a mother, and I'm worried about my mother, and I wondered about how that influenced your process.
A lot.
Did it? Right. Can you tell me a little bit about how you related to each other as obviously individuals, and then as when you were devising, when you were coming up with things, how did you play around at those ideas about motherhood and all of those tricky things?
It was about a year ago we did the R&D like Lian mentioned, and a lot of it was us exploring the theme, but also our own connection with our femininity, with our idea of who we are as women in the world, what choices we have, and a lot of that is impacted by our upbringing, our influences, how we were brought up, and that connects with our mothers. And I think that mother-daughter connection is very strong, and we all shared quite a lot in that process. And even moving on from that process into rehearsals, we had challenges at times, like, I just want to do that with my mom, or that's totally how it is with my family, or or I wouldn't give in that easily, or I'd totally, I'd retaliate at that point. And so we brought a lot of the collective experience together to try and explore the themes. But I think what you said previously was very key, that this is, for me, exploring this, I hadn't got the experience that a lot of the cast have of being from East Asia. I haven't got that experience, so it was connecting with the universality, and I think for me that was connection as a woman to other women, to men, and how we're viewed in the world, and that was really imperative as part of the process, wasn't it?
I think there's also something interesting in that question that connects back to the earlier question, because I think it's also about what you don't know. So Wei goes into the beginning of this story not knowing about her mother's story, not knowing about her grandmother's story, and it's a process of discovery, and of course intensified through the year. So there's something, I think, in that relationship that's about what you know, and so we drew on some of that in some of the work we did when we were looking at own experiences and how they connected with the themes of the play. But there's also what you don't know, and speaking, my mother died about a year ago, and there are things now I'm learning about her because people speak differently about her. And I think there's something about that we're all in one particular place in time, but we will learn things about our mothers and our grandmothers and learn to understand them better as we become mothers and grandmothers, that mean that all of this is shifting, I think, all the time. Sorry,
I just want to say, it reminds me one of the Amy Tan's works, the Bond Sister's Daughter, also talk about the mother-daughter relationships.
Yes.
I hope that even if this isn't your story personally, for example, that because I'm the same, it's not my personal story, but I really find joy in sort of certain moments intergenerationally, like the mother-daughter, grandmother-daughter, and grandchild. Those like tiny details that make that relationship really rich and full. I hope that is translated for you as an audience to see, and that is like the tensions between those relationships are sort of holding the story together. I hope.
Yeah, and it was interesting you speaking there, because also, of course, there are older women that have seen this play and found it quite painful. So there are bits of the story that are their narrative. So it's going back to that thing of what bits do we connect with, and use the bits we connect with to build an understanding of whatever it is to us, whether that's a generational thing or a cultural thing.
When I was watching the show at the theater, I was wondering if the director is Chinese or not. And you're not.
She's 1/8
I'm a
Chinese.
16th Chinese. She's my great grandma. It's true. Yeah.
So I'm still interested. What's the script impress you the most, and what's your reflection of the story? Because you bring the story into the UK context. So what do you want to say to the audience?
Yeah.
It's quite a lot of questions
there.
So I'm going to unpack that. So your reflections, Justine, on the script, and what as a director you want this piece and your interpretation of it to say to a UK audience.
I think that in terms of the script, it was amazing going on the journey with Amy, because we started with something really quite skeletal, and as people have said, worked with her on it a year ago, and then I continued to work on the script with our dramaturg to shape it. So seeing it grow into the richness that it is now was quite a journey. But I think the thing that I find extraordinary about it is, in a way, I think what you see in the first half and then the second half. The first half is quite a domestic piece, and not that substantial in a way. It's the relationship between Lucy and Wei, and you're not quite sure where it's going, and then there's this slightly strange thing at the end where Grandma dies, and Mum has a little smile as she begins to realise what this means for her. But then the second half, I just think it becomes so much more complex, and so much more, it sort of begins to sit well in the set, I think, in the second half, because it becomes a lot more epic. I think it tells extraordinary and extreme but nevertheless common experiences of women in terms of loss of babies, loss of life that was so important to them, and the silence that goes alongside that. So I think, and that's not just about those particular narratives in China, but how that resonates. So that's what excited me about the script, that mix of personal and political. And then in terms of, what was the second question?
It was like bringing it to the UK.
Yes. So, well, I've said some of it, but maybe I can just talk about the bigger context of our work here at the Belgrade. So because I used to say dual heritage, I'm multiple heritage. So I suppose I've always been very passionate about telling stories from the diversity of the UK's communities, whether that's young people's stories, the stories of people arriving from the Caribbean, the stories of young African kids who are growing up with African parents that have been born here, or, the diversity of the stories in our city, and so have been a real sort of driver in promoting diversity in the theatre, whether that's the staff, whether it's the programme, and our participation opportunities, bringing new audiences in. It feels really important that this is a space and a home, because it's such an extraordinary space, for everybody in the city to engage in dialogue with each other about their own stories and each other's stories. So it was really part of that, very much involved in talent development in the theatre, making sure that there are pathways for young people from all ethnicities, all backgrounds, sexualities, etc., coming into the theatre. And Lian joined us as part of that talent development drive. So we became hosts in a project, partners in a project that was about growing producers from Black and minority ethnic communities. Lian got the position with us for 18 months. She had some money with that position to make a piece of work, and she had a number of options, and she could have developed this story. She could have been involved in producing a story that was brought to us by a white male director and a white male writer, albeit about Africa. She could have been involved in producing an existing piece of written work. We looked at a piece by a Black American writer. But for me, what was interesting about Lian being with us was her idea about the marriage markets and the women's story, and what she could bring to the theatre in terms of her own passion and excitement, because that's where you get the best work, and also how that resonated with a growing community in our city that we're not yet engaging with, and we're not yet properly in dialogue with. So that's what made me feel very passionate about it. And my great-great-grandfather was Chinese.
I'm so aware that we've only just scratched the surface of this conversation, because there's a lot to talk about, but I'm afraid to say we have pushed our time, and I am going to have to stop us. Okay. If we can keep it short, because we're now at 10 to 11.
Sorry, guys. I'm so sorry. Firstly, congratulations on. I really enjoyed it. I felt it's interesting. Majority female audience. I felt both very impressed and occasionally quite uncomfortable in situations. And please do treat it as a success, because I think that's part of the point of it. I think it's interesting relating to some of the stories in there, like when you the whole thing about family, how important family is in Chinese culture, especially, and actually, not just Chinese culture, everywhere. But I could even relate to things like, I know with my grandmother, for instance, she's, doesn't mean to play favourites, but my cousin, who is from the male line of the family, would be treated slightly differently.
You got a bowl of rice?
No, it's a nice metaphor for it. And then I really like the use of umbrellas as part of the play, both as a plot device to move it along, occasionally a bit scary, maybe it's at the front as well. But also in terms of using it as a metaphor for so many things as well. So really enjoyed it.
Thank you so much for your reflection, and I am going to stop us there, I'm afraid to say. But can I just first of all thank you so much for joining us and asking such thoughtful, provocative questions, and for challenging why we make the work that we make and how it reflects communities that are here in Coventry and your experiences. But can you join me in thanking these remarkable women for